All right, so welcome to our talk, adaptive Spring applications with profiles and more, or something like that. The idea is...
So how many of you are here for multi-environment Spring? That's in another room.
I'm just kidding.
No, just kidding. We like this title better, so
Yeah.
things morphed a little bit, and I think we made it better. So.
Yeah, the original premise. What was the original premise?
I don't know. The original premise was around supporting multiple environments and what can be done with profiles. And we had a bit of a shock that the talk was longer than expected, I think, at least for me. Never spoke at Spring 1 before. I was expecting a 45-minute talk. And since these are an hour and a half, we thought we'd...
Level up.
We'd double up and made it adaptive, I guess.
We adapted our talk on adapting.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say here, and what he said. Right then, so this needs to be on for that to work.
No, I didn't
You
plug
didn't plug it in. You guys were wondering why the slides weren't progressing, and I was wondering the same thing, so it's okay. Right, so my name is Josh Long. I'm the developer advocate for Spring at Pivotal, or Spring, just Spring asterisk, all the other projects too, all the open source Spring stuff. I'm the author lead author, or the only author on 4 different books about Spring, and also a new video series from Addison Wesley or Pearson, or whatever the name of that company is these days. I'm happy to see you guys. So welcome to the first Spring one since we've been part of Pivotal. It's a very important event for us. Very
good. And I'm Kevin Nilson. Lots of stuff about me. So I just recently joined Google as a developer advocate on the Chromecast. I'm a Java champion, 3-time JavaOne rock star, and wrote a book many years ago, Web 2.0 Fundamentals. But I'm probably most known because I run 3 of the largest user groups in the Bay Area. So I run the Java user group. Yeah, in the world, probably. The Java user group, the JavaScript meetup, and the Google developer group. And actually started the first GTUG, or Google Technology User Group, 5.5 years ago, the first one. And today there's...
all over the world, yeah.
They're all over the world. So things are going quite well. And at one point in time, I was crazy enough to teach some college courses up at the College of San Mateo. So I ended up teaching a lot of DBA's Java back around the...
That was your fault?
Yeah, that was my fault. So.
That's what I wrote in the period when we started having things like Java inside the SQL queries.
Absolutely.
Damn it.
Absolutely. Those DBAs were freaks. We're like, where's my PL SQL? And they came to me for help.
PL Java. We blame him.
Yeah. JSQL, I don't know. This slide's kind of empty, Josh. What are we going to say here?
Well, just that. This whole introduction. The idea is progressively building an application that's more responsive and more adaptable. There are a few ways to do this, so we'll take a look at a few of them in this talk. That's the idea. The first way to do this stuff is to put down the coffee, because it's so good. The first kind of way to adapt an application, and the original kernel of this talk, I suppose, is this idea that you can change the way things are configured using the container, right? Most of us are... How many of you have used... Okay, I think I'm being rhetorical. How many of you have used the Spring XML configuration format? Whew, okay.
I love that stuff.
Well, it's there, that's for sure. It works well. It's been around for forever and a day, right? We've had it since day 1. And the idea is that you configure a bean in XML, and you can tell, you can let Spring do what it does best by default. It'll construct your bean for you using a no-argument constructor, okay? If you want to get fancy, you can have it call a different method for initialization. The genesis of this capability is fairly simple. Sometimes you don't create a new bean. Sometimes, you want to set up state after certain properties have been satisfied with dependency injection. Sometimes you want to change the state of the things after you've had all the constructor arguments, right? You would think that you might think that the constructor is a great place to do this kind of initialization, but again, setters don't get called until after the constructor is called. So all those fields that you're depending on the container to inject are going to be null. So you can tell Spring, in the XML configurations format, I don't want you to just call the constructor. I want you to also call this init method, right? You can specify that in the XML. If you want to also destroy the resource when the context shuts down, you can specify the destroy method. You can do this with annotations. How many of you have used JSR 250 style annotations from the Java EE5 era? So we have
the folks on the right. It's kind of interesting.
All the folks on the right?
All the folks on the right have done that, it seemed like to me. But
none of you on the left?
No, a few.
We all did it once in college, don't lie. So yeah, you can annotate your beans. This removes sort of redundant configuration. Now you don't have to stipulate the stuff inside the actual class itself. It just, I mean, in the XML and in the class, right? You've got this idea that this method needs to be called in the class, but then in the configuration you have to actually tell the container. Now you don't have to. Spring will automatically just sort of understand that you want this method to be called after all the properties have been set and after all the dependencies have been satisfied, and that you want this other method to be called when you're shutting down the context, kind of like a finalizer or garbage collection hook. We've had, since day one, the initializing properties, initializing bean rather, and the disposable bean interfaces. How many of you have used those? I would actually say that this came first. I should probably have preceded the previous slide with this one. This was available since day one, then we added the support for the annotations. The nice thing about this interface, these interfaces, is that there's no way to disable them. You can, in fact, disable the registration and parsing of the annotations in your beans, but you cannot disable this. So if you want to ship a library that somebody else is going to reuse and they're going to put it inside the Spring container, implement that interface and you'll be guaranteed that the lifecycle of your beans, the construction lifecycle, will be honored. Oh, by the by, if you have questions as we're talking, please don't even hesitate. Just throw it up and we'll field it as we can, okay? So yeah, you know, back to that original problem. The Spring uses the no argument constructor by default. You don't really have a, you know, you can do a lot in a constructor, but by default it's just going to use the no argument constructor. If you specify arguments using the XML, for example, you can do that. And we even have a very convenient C: namespace. How many of you guys have heard of the C: namespace? The idea is, have you guys used, okay, wait, let's try this again. How many of you have heard of the P: namespace? Right, so about the same people. Not just the right, though. Interesting. The idea is, in the XML, you want a concise way to represent the properties of a bean, so you can say P: property 1 equals, and then just specify an attribute value, or you can say P: property -1, ref equals, and then reference another bean, instead of actually specifying a property element stands underneath the bean configuration. For constructors, we have the same thing. So it's C:, and then you just say, so you say bean tag C:, argument, the name of the constructor, argument 1 equals whatever, C:, argument 2, whatever. It becomes very concise. But you do have to specify all that in the constructor, so it gets a little annoying. And as I say, sometimes you don't want just to call a regular bean. You don't want to just create and construct a regular bean. Sometimes you want to mix it up, Sometimes Spring doesn't have the canonical bean that you need. Sometimes it lives somewhere else, and you need to actually just obtain a reference to it. How many of you have had the displeasure of using JNDI on purpose at some point? Me too. Yeah, sorry, man. Hugs later. I'm not kidding. It's all good. This is what we're here for. So the idea is that sometimes you need a bean, but you don't want to construct it anew. You want to just obtain the reference from somewhere else. Historically, the way that we do that is using the factory method pattern, right? We've codified that into something called the factory bean interface in the core container. It's been around, again, since day one. The idea is you have a recipe for constructing and obtaining an object. And you write that recipe inside this code, and then that becomes the thing that you reuse and share among your colleagues. So, for example, if I wanted to construct a very fancy bean with lots of different properties that have lots of different conditionals and lots of state that you have to check to do it correctly, I would hide all that behind the curtain of a factory bean and make it so that somebody could construct that object using the factory bean. We have a JNDI factory bean, for example, you specify what you need, and then the factory bean will do what it needs to do to connect to the local JNDI context, find the bean, cast it, and return it for you, okay? Have you guys used factory beans? Whew. Okay, moving on, good. Now, this is where things get awesome. In 2005, I'm going to go with 5 until proven wrong. In 2005, we introduced the Java configuration project, the Spring Java configuration. How many of you had played with Java configuration? All right, my kind of people. So that was a project that sat adjacent to the core container, and then we sort of folded it into the core container right around 2009, coincident with the release of Spring 3.0. And the use case here is, I want to do my configuration, and I've already got annotations, right? I've already got the ability to stick an annotation on a bean and have it swept up in a scan when the container starts up. But I want to more explicitly construct my beans. I want to actually just create the beans, set the properties, and do all that stuff, just as I would in one XML document. I can now do it in one Java class. I can actually see the wiring of the beans in one place. They're not spread throughout my my components in the application context. So Java configuration here is just a class. You annotate factory beans, or factory methods rather, with the @bean annotation, and you do whatever you want. You can call the factory. You can reuse our factory beans. You can just create the objects any way you like. It's really nice. You don't have that bit of indirection. You don't necessarily need to go through a factory bean. You can actually just write whatever code you want, and you have the full power of the Java language, if then, all that stuff. It turns out that Java is really quite natural at describing Java objects. So this was very, very useful when we had this, And then I think other people started catching on. So then you had Juice, came out a little bit later than that, and then there's another sort of configuration mechanism that came out of the standard space that not quite. I think they didn't understand what we meant by dependency injection when we said plain old beans. But the point is that they're all Java-centric, so it's good to see that we were validated by that idea, Okay, so questions on this? On Java configuration? That's pretty important, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. The use case is this class gets loaded by the container. You specify this class to the application context. It skulks through all the beans all the bean methods defined in the configuration class, calls each method for you, and returns the bean and stores it in the application context under the ID that you either specify in the bean annotation or the name of the method. So whereas in the XML I might have said bean class equals some sort of data source and the ID equals Postgres, here I'm just going to do it in Java configuration. If I want to obtain a reference to another bean, I can either invoke the method directly or just simply declare an argument in my bean factory method. Okay, and that'll be injected for me at runtime. The semantics you expect from the XML are preserved, of course. So if I, in my customer service method, if I were to call the data source, the Postgres method 1,000 times in a for loop, and I had, awesome. If I were to call that method in a for loop inside of my bean configuration method 1,000 times, I would still just get one singleton instance, assuming default scope for the beans are preserved. The scope is honored, right? So even though I'm calling the method 1,000 times, the Spring context will cache the reference, store it in the context, and then return that for me fully initialized and ready to use on all subsequent invocations. So all this to say, we've got a lot of, factory methods are pretty awesome. This pattern, this idea of hiding that recipe in some sort of easy to use place is very, very convenient. You see it not just in Spring, but you see it in other places as well. So we have our factory bean, of course. We have the provider interface in JSR 330. How many of you guys are using JSR 330? The javax.inject.asterisk stuff? It's really, really, really swell. I'm a fan. And of course, it's natively supported by Spring. So if you can, try using that because it's, it's very convenient. It's very nice. So what these classes do is they codify a recipe for creating a bean, okay? Because you can't just pass around a method delegate yet. You can't just say, hey, if you want to create a bean, call this function. So what you do is you create a recipe. You create this class. You create a provider instance or a factory bean instance. And, you could even, not that I would, but if you think about it, the java.util.concurrent.callable is just another way of saying this is a reference, this is a proxy, it's a holder for some way of obtaining this object if I need it. I just invoke it and I'll get the reference back. So these are all factory methods in disguise, right? These are all factory methods in disguise. How many of you guys have looked at Java 8? Tell me yes. Oh, guys, if you haven't done that yet, after you've gotten this coffee, go check out Java 8. It's going to be epic. The things that are coming in Java 8, one of the features that I'm most looking forward to are lambdas, right? The idea is that I can now take any interface that has one method and then just use that, just describe it as a lambda, an anonymous function. Because more often than not, these interfaces that have just one method are just, a kludge. They're a way to get around the fact that we can't pass around method delegates. So that provider I was showing you guys earlier, or the factory bean, well, not the factory bean, but the provider, the java.util.concurrent.callable, are all just wrappers. They're just all sort of goofy ways of saying to the Java language, I want to hide this recipe for creating this object in some sort of block that I can execute ad hoc.
Very good.
Okay, so making sure we had all that in place. I'm going to hand this back to Kevin.
Yeah. So how long, Josh, have you been waiting for Lambdas? Do you know?
Oh my God, years and years and years. It was, you know, do you guys know that was supposed to be delivered 2 years ago? And then they delayed again, and it was supposed to be delivered this year. They delayed again, and then now it's Q1 2014.
It's coming. The train has left the station.
Before we go on to the next section, questions on that. I know a lot of it's sort of baseline level setting. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Anything I missed? Comments, feedback, tomatoes? Where do you guys even get tomatoes? Why do you bring them to technical conferences? How? Ideas? Okay.
Cool. So I'll kind of jump in, talk a little about environment and profiles. But before I do that, I'll tell you one more thing about Lambdas. So, you know, I've been running the Java user group for about 7 years now. And the guy who helped sponsor the meetup in the beginning was Neil Gafter. And actually, the first event that I was a part of for the Java user group was Neil Gafter's Lambda proposal that had working implementations, and that's like 7 years ago. So that's how long I've been waiting for Lambdas. Anyway, it's a long time.
Meanwhile, every other language, including C++, guys, a standards body that meets once every 5 years, they have managed to implement and deliver and then iterate upon Lambdas. Wow.
Very good. So, you know, I'm going to talk about environments and kind of how they bridge into profiles and solve some of these issues. So when you write a Java application, you know, today, one of the things that you really don't know when you create that war is where it's going to be deployed, what's going to be available, is going to be a full J2EE container, you know, are you going to be running on Tomcat, are you going to be running on JBoss, or is it going to be something?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
How many people are running on Tomcat? Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Warms my heart. TC server?
A handful? How many Jetty lovers out there? I love Jetty.
Me too. What about,
Tomcat
how many of you have had the dubious pleasure of running on web asterisk? Just fill in the other one. Oh, guys, like I said, that hug offer is definitely on the table.
How many of you are running on Spring Boot? Oh. We will ask that question next year.
Yeah.
And
expect to see a 100% turnout.
Yeah, very good.
So any of these, what about, how many of you are using continuous integration to validate your tests and all that stuff? Okay,
Jenkins?
Good. Right on.
Anything else?
Hudson? Right on.
Team City?
Team City is awesome too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bamboo, one of those.
And how many of you, I'm
Anybody still doing cruise control?
I remember that thing.
Yeah, I did a bunch of cruise control, man,
Wow.
a long time ago.
That's a thing. Good.
Showing my age.
Way to bring it back. Do you guys, I expect a full complement of hands. Maybe I'm wrong. You guys unit test, right? Okay.
Yeah, he's like, maybe. Only in an interview.
Well, there's definitely a lot of places you can run your code.
Very good.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
All right. Moving on. So one of the things that Spring did, you know,
3.1?
What's that?
It's in 3.1, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that Spring did when, you know, Cloud Foundry coming out and a lot of this, you know, PaaS environments and things like that, in Spring 3.1, environments and profiles were announced. And it's really kind of an abstraction around your environment. Lets you kind of inspect your environment, where are you at, you know, asking, where am I? And it lets you do things like look at properties within the system so that you can tailor those specifically to what environment that you're in. Other questions, you know, here you can ask about your database, what's the connection URL, or what's the username, what's the password, things like that. And this environment abstraction is really nice because it lets you kind of keep that separate when you're doing your configuration, provides a lot of support for kind of grouping beans by profiles and things like that, and we'll drill into that here as we move forward. So I'll do just a quick demo on Josh's machine, so let's see what happens.
Okay. This is, how many of you guys are using Eclipse? Just making sure. STS? The best way to do
how are people
Eclipse?
using STS but not using Eclipse? That was kind of
should have done a cross-cut.
Yeah.
Can you guys all see that? Do we need to zoom in or something?
Oh, what's this?
Visibility in the back. How are you guys doing? Uh-oh. Can you make it bigger? Fonts?
Yeah,
I think you go to
here. I'll just do one of these
Oh.
because I don't have that big of whatever. All right. So let's look at just
Zoom
real
in?
quick. Yeah, well.
Yeah, give us 1
Yeah.
sec. We'll do it right
Yeah.
now.
Whoops, sorry.
Let's just do the preferences.
I can just do that.
But we'll just
No?
change the code editor. That way we don't have to remember. Preferences. Font. And then basic. And then, what is it now? Editor font, something like that. Go down. Text font. Voila.
All right. Say when. Oh no, 14?
Try
18?
18, yeah.
Very good. Go down.
Can you guys read Monaco 18, the Quick Brown Fox, blah, blah, blah? Yeah?
Good enough? All right.
Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. So talking about environments, the first thing you need to do is work with your context, get your context available. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But here, from your context, you're able to get access to your environment. And from there, oops, let me make that where we can scroll around here. There we are. So I'm able to grab properties such as your user directory. So where are you running? And maybe you may do some craziness to determine if you're on Mac or if you're on Windows or if you're in the cloud, Cloud Foundry, something like that. So wow, I changed something. I wonder what I changed. Oh, I changed more. Oh, that's what I wanted. Let's go back up here. So I'll run this for you, and you'll see kind of an output telling you, what directory we're running this on Josh's machine here. There we are. So it's in Josh's code, adaptive Spring, and
so that property, by the way, that's the Java properties. So that one particular property you could have gotten through system.get properties.
Absolutely.
It's just another way of doing that.
Yeah. So environments let you abstract a lot of things, and we'll kind of drill into that a bit more. All right. First demo out of the way. So now property sources kind of lets you define your own properties at runtime, or at construction time, and then add those into the context. So this is actually kind of a fancy thing. I've actually leveraged it. Has anybody used property sources in this way before? Yeah.
Wait,
Anybody?
another question. How many of you wanted to resolve values against a database before? Wouldn't that be great instead of having a config.properties file? This is your hook, guys.
Yeah.
So you write one of these and adapt.
So how I use this, I put a lot of default properties inside of my war that I almost always wanted to use. But sometimes you change passwords or whatever it is, and you don't want to rebuild that war. So big project I did recently, Just Me, we actually used property sources like this, and we read from EC2 tags. So EC2 tags let you kind of say, for this instance or for this Linux box, these are kind of system-wide properties that you can kind of modify in their GUI. And so what I would do is when the context booted, I would read those properties or those EC2 tags and then use those to override anything. Because I think the last line you can add first into your available properties. And so you can use that to override what's already there if you want.
Like the precedence, sort of.
Yeah, yeah. You can define that precedence. I think there's probably like an add last as well.
There's
right?
an add last. There's,
yeah.
I don't know.
So it depends if you want it to override or not. So this is actually, like for myself, I found this to be really, really nice because a lot of times I didn't want to go through all the pain of rebuilding a war, getting it deployed, all that. But I wanted to make configuration changes. And this was a great way of doing that. And then being able to have part of my configuration in my war. I had another override that was actually in a directory, sort of extra class path on the server. But because I'm in an EC2 cloud environment, things are going up and down all the time. So it's a lot, new instances as load increases, instances disappear. So I found it a lot easier to manage through EC2 tags. And this was a great way of making that happen. Another convenience method is the annotation for property source. So you can kind of, as you're defining a configuration, you can specify the path or location of where you'll get a property file. So I think this is really nice to keep it all in one place.
It's a shortcut for that original mechanism, right?
Yes.
By the by, while I remember, smile. Can you say spring?
So I've got an 11-month-old, so I feel like I should be like going boo, 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 something. You guys don't mind, do you?
Thanks, guys.
Hey guys, how is the property source different or the same as the property placeholder figure?
Thank you. I didn't pay this guy to ask. Do you want? Can I tackle that, or do you want to tackle it?
Go for it.
So we've had since time immemorial this property placeholder resolution mechanism inside the core container. You just say context : property placeholder and then specify a property file, and it loads the property file and makes the keys available as properties that you can then interpolate into your bean definitions using $ curly bracket key curly bracket for values. Okay, value literals. This is very convenient, but it is, as I mentioned, limited to just property files. We introduced a more generic mechanism with the environment, okay? This property sources mechanism is fully pluggable. So instead of just resolving properties against a property file, you can now resolve them against, a database, a JNDI tree, randomly. You could say, okay, based on the stock of a certain company, it should be this or that, whatever. And even better, with the environment abstraction, we made it so that you can access these values in Java, right? So we're not just using $ curly bracket key values in XML documents now. I can now dynamically inspect this stuff. I can actually ask the environment for these properties and configure things in my Java configuration class. So it serves the same effect as the property placeholder resolution, but think of it as a much broader, much more flexible superset. Okay? Does that help? Maybe? Okay.
Cool.
Any other questions? Because that's a great point.
Yeah.
So there was this comments function which you would use in conjunction with placeholder, so it reads the properties of the database.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys use that code, or it's completely different?
I don't even know what it is, so I suspect that's probably very useful, though.
Cool.
But it's now far easier, so I wouldn't use it now.
Yeah.
You can just do the property source. So the question is, you asked if there's a commons library from Apache, maybe?
Yeah,
You're talking about, there's a commons configuration library, apparently, that works with Spring's placeholder resolution mechanism?
From placeholder.
Sweet. Well, that's cool. I didn't know about that. So if you're stuck on prior to 3.1 and you want a way to resolve properties against the database, this sounds like a great way to do it.
You have an
Hi.
expert to talk to.
Is it possible to have several environments?
Yes.
Oh,
Several property placeholder configures?
It's a collection. So as you saw on the last slide, you can just add them. They're additive. So
But when I go to the
Whoa.
an environment to check, then there's just one like context of get environment.
right.
I need the database environment, and I need
he's talking about environments, not properties.
Oh, and we will address that problem. There's not distinct environments, but there is a way to achieve what you're looking for. Just stay tuned. You're in the right talk, despite
Yeah, properties would be
Hi,
sorry,
sir.
profiles.
So there is actually, oh boy.
Repeat the question because I didn't.
The
even
question was, can I use the environment abstraction inside my XML as I would of the property placeholder things, so as to avoid redundant declaration of property sources or whatever? You don't want to have property placeholders here, and then a whole different mechanism in Java. And yes, absolutely. So may I?
Yeah, absolutely.
The question, of course. So I'm going to see if I can find the class here. So the way it works, by the way, property placeholder configurer. I think it's this guy. Give it a second.
Are we on? Yeah,
Yeah,
we
we
are
are.
on the network.
Property sources placeholder configure. This is the one you want. So what happens is we have this concept of what is this now? A bean factory post processor. Okay, a bean factory post processor is an object that gets instantiated before every other thing in the container. There's a runtime level, like Linux. When the context boots up, you have a runtime level before the actual beans are constructed. When we're still thinking, when the container is still thinking in terms of, I have a class name that I need to instantiate. It has this ID. Here's the string. Here's the map of string properties and the string values, and then that gets inflated into a real live object. That metadata, you can actually work with it, and you can manipulate it, and you can actually ask questions of it even before Spring is, hydrated or inflated these objects, these values. So, if you want to do something like change a value, such as a value inside of an XML document. Imagine, for example, just a hypothetical. Imagine you had an XML document that had these fancy $ curly bracket key things going on in your values, and you somehow need to change that fancy curly bracket $ thingy into an actual value resolved against a property file. That's what we're doing, right? You can actually do that at this level. You can actually inspect all the metadata and change that curly bracket, whatever, into an actual value retrieved against the property file. And then that component will be initialized later on, and then that value will actually be the actual value from the property file, and everything will work. So when you inspect the code, you'll see the value from the property file, not the $, whatever. Well, that mechanism is available to you guys. You guys can write your own Bean Factory post processors if you like. And that's all we're doing here when we wrote the property placeholder support, is we have a Bean Factory post processor that goes through all the Bean definitions in the XML context, resolves the properties against the property file, and then makes them available in the configuration. To do the same thing with the environment abstraction, you just register a property sources placeholder configure, I think. And then it'll resolve in the same way properties against the environment. So if you add properties to the environment using add first and add last, and then you use this in the XML, because you can do both, right? You can have XML and Java configuration. Then this will delegate. It'll ultimately pass through to the environment instead of just the original mechanism. So does that help? You register one of these, and it's a Bean Factory post processor. So if you're using Java configuration, it has to be a static bean. Okay? Because remember, this gets initialized before the rest of the container. But other than that, yeah, it's the same as you'd think. So you can do that in XML and your $, curly bracket stuff, so it works. Questions on that? Okay.
Good.
Or if you're using just XML, you just register a bean. But either way, yeah, it works. You can work the same way, no problem. Voila.
This one, cool. All right, I think, yeah. So this is just sort of stitching it all together, showing how, defining a property source, pointing to a property file, and then later in your configuration for your database, that's used for looking up the various values.
And that's a magic object, sort of, the environment. You can just say @inject environment in env.
Yeah,
and
anywhere in it.
Yeah.
It's just magically available for you, which is really nice. All right, so we will do a quick demo of this. Get this guy out of the way.
All this code will be on.
It is on GitHub.
It is on GitHub. What's the
Will
UI?
be. It's like Josh Long, Adaptive Spring.
GitHub.com/my profile. And I think it's called Adaptive Spring. I think you might be right.
Yeah.
If you want to play along at home, you're more than welcome to.
Cool. So here's a quick example of a property source, just showing those. So here we've defined our own Scott Tiger. Everybody knows where that's from? Anybody? Oracle. Very close. Yeah. That's, I don't know, it's in all lots of production systems use that, username and password.
It's really bad.
Yeah. And so after that, you define the map property source. So that, whoops, let me get that Java doc out of the way. And then you get your property sources and add that to the beginning so that you can add these that you defined right in line here. And so that's kind of where I was talking about, using things, like EC2 tags and things like that that can be added in here. So from there, I'll show the values that I just recently added. And then below, this is a value that we're reading from
You have an annotation?
The annotation, which is over in the configuration class, which I can show you real quick. And there's my annotation. The Java config doesn't do too much in this hello world example. So let's go ahead and run that. And wow, this resolution is really throwing me off. I hope you all can see, though. Very good. All right, so here's some stuff from the properties. The database password, username Scott, password Tiger, and then here's where we read that from the property source, one of the values there.
That's the bean. I'm sorry, guys. The bean I was trying to show you guys earlier, it's actually property sources, property resolver. Mm-hmm. That's the one that ultimately passes through to the environment, I think. One of those two.
Very good. So any questions so far? All pretty straightforward stuff, I think. So let's jump back in.
Hurry.
Yeah, so multiple implementations, right? So we asked earlier how many people are unit testing, things like that. one of the things that Spring was really created around was being able to have mocks, things like that, having multiple implementations, one that's really for production, and another that may not really completely work, right? And for testing, this is really nice when you have something that's non-predictive or is slow. So for myself,
In the enterprise? Slow?
Yeah.
Non-predictive?
Yeah.
No.
So many years ago, I worked for, or not many years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I worked for E-Trade Financial and did a lot of work with the stock market and streaming quotes and streaming portfolios and things like that. And I did a lot of work around things like formatting the price of a stock. And it's very non-predictive. You ask the market what it is, and you have no idea, right? Other positions, I worked for Southwestern Bell, did a lot of analytics stuff back in 2001, web analytics. And we had queries that would take 24 hours to run. So I was building a front end for a query that took 24 hours to run. And by mocking that out, this is pre-Spring, but at that time, using static factories and things like that, I was able to provide an alternate implementation that would complete immediately, right? Other times where mocking is really nice is when testing things like edge conditions, right? So one of the pieces of work I did at E-Trade was the streaming portfolio with Comet and WebSockets, and basically pushing quotes to the browser. And I would get asked questions by management like, well, what if someone owns 10,000 stocks in their portfolio? And can you tell me how that'll behave, or can you show me? And that would mean me like clicking in the UI for, I don't know, 3 weeks, or I don't even know, they'd reboot the data or something in the middle. And it just wouldn't be possible. But I could answer questions like that very, very quickly, right? Also, mocking is really important for productivity. So services aren't always available. And the work I did at E-Trade, this was especially true. A lot of the teams that I ran were front-end oriented, and they would build front ends for services. And those services, we didn't own them. We didn't understand the code or anything like that. And they would be updated twice a week. And each time they updated, it wasn't uncommon for that to be down for 2 hours. And so if you take that twice a week by 2 hours, kind of worst case scenario, but it wasn't that uncommon, you're 10% of the time your team is completely unable to work. Services are slow. We talked about that earlier. And one of the things, it just me as VP of Engineering for a startup recently. And one of the things, having that startup, and it's really kind of a race to the finish, like trying to get something out. And as you start thinking about requirements, you want to build that front end and the back end at the exact same time. You really can't double the amount of time that it takes to get a product out the door. And that's true of enterprise, startup, anyone. You really want to define those interfaces up front and then write mock implementations, stubs, whatever it is, so that your front-end team can get working. So, one of the things that was announced, I don't know, Spring, whatever, annotations, whatever that is. No, it's
2.0 is the first annotation, yeah.
Yeah. So annotations came out, and it was a really great thing. So I've been using Spring since a long, long time. And annotations came out, and I got really excited. So great. Here we go. So what I want to do, I have a video service for searching YouTube. I may not be online. I want to make a mock available. And so what do? I add 2 annotations for that service, right? And so what happens when you do this? Boom, no unique bean definition exception. So you have this problem, found 2 beans. How do you solve that? And so I immediately said, OK, I need to go back to XML. I created 2 XML files. I said this annotation thing is for like people nowhere near as smart as me, who don't mock things, who are waiting 24 hours to test their line of code or whatever it is. And I really kind of said, Spring's not ready for annotations, was a lot of my thought. And so I went back to XML, and did some crazy awk scripts and things like that to flip out what's in my web XML and which beans get loaded. And anyway.
And you kept the things external to the deployment?
Yes. Yes and no.
Oh, so you'd have different builds?
I would have different builds
typically. That's even worse.
So I was not externalizing the config, anything.
How many of you have externalized the config? It's okay, you're among friends, no judging, no judging. It's okay, it's okay.
But I don't know how to extend a WebXML. I mean, WebXML is like a bit much to be putting outside of your world.
No, not that, but the Spring
But,
context.
yeah.
I know it's a very common...
I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, this is a long time ago. I don't know what I'm doing today either.
No, it's not true. There's a common anti-pattern. I've seen it more times than I can count. Somebody has all the beans they need except for maybe the data source. And then that is a file that's on the file system instead of inside the class path. And you take this var, deploy it to production, change the file system XML to point to production database. But then in development, you point to local, right? Mm-hmm. And that's really, that's sort of like walking around with your heart hanging out. You know, it's really, you don't want to do that. That's code that goes in your deployment assembly.
Mm-hmm. So how this is solved is with profiles, right? So I can define for this service that implement, I have two implementations for the video service. And one is the YouTube profile, and the other is, no mouse. And the other is the mock profile. So you see kind of these two implementations. And there was a question over here about, can I have multiple environments loaded at the same time? You can have as many profiles loaded as you want. And so one of the things that I have done in the past is for each service, I would put it on its own profile. So that, as I had all these dependencies out in the wild of other teams I depended on, when their stuff went up and down or wasn't completed, I could flip things to mock and live as I wished.
Or do you have groupings of profiles maybe? Like this is service set for this service, mock versus real?
More like the things I did and the things others did.
Yeah, okay.
Well, yeah. It was very helpful. Definitely aligned along the service. So these profiles can also be set very easily in unit test. So this is kind of an example of that.
You're saying active profiles there, yeah?
Yes.
For the four of you that raised your hand about unit testing, that's what you would use if you wanted to load the bean specific to a profile. You want to load the mocks only. And you don't get that no unique bean definition thing problem. Question?
I saw add profiles, and I saw add active profiles. Is that like in one place you're defining them, and the other place you're using them?
Exactly. In my unit test, I'm stipulating that I want to load this application context and then inject beans from that context. But the question is, well, which bean? If I have two video services, I need to load the one that is specific to my mock profile. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying active profile for this test is mock. I don't want to actually hit production, Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of my main application that loads the YouTube context. Right here it says YouTube. And so when I run this, we're going to see results. And the results are quite funny, but I may have to...
Censor?
I may have to skip them a little bit. But I think, this one I'm not really sure. Head kicks, I've been doing that a lot.
You know the Pink Ranger?
And the Pink Ranger.
Power Ranger?
I thought that was a video we did together. I was Kimberly and you were the Pink Ranger.
Shut up. You said you would never talk about that.
I don't know. But then it gets into more reasonable stuff, like Chronicles of Web Standards, a panel I did on Comet, and HTML5 testing, and it gets, some Google I/O stuff. But then back to the Pink Ranger. So I don't know.
It's a little weird.
So maybe I don't want that to show up, and I want, I don't know. I want to...
Something you can show to the director of engineering without being embarrassed?
Yeah. So we've got a test in here that does the same thing. There it is. Sorry, I was really struggling to find it. But I defined that as mock. And when I run that, I'm only going to show two videos that you see hard-coded in there. Whoa. Eclipse. Well, let's use the Android one. Sorry. And there they are, the two videos, the Google I/O and the testing and all.
Hard-coded.
Hard-coded, yeah. So that's just a stub, doesn't really do anything, always returns the same videos. But it allows you, do things like, if you wanted to worry about UTF-8 characters or something like that, but you don't necessarily, I didn't do any Chinese videos or anything like that I know of. So it allows you some flexibility there. So profiles can be very, very useful for grouping beans together. And so here's kind of some examples of, you've got your dev stack, your cloud stack, your QA stack, maybe a stage stack, where you can put everything together and have beans. These beans may behave the same, they may behave differently. It may only be username and passwords or JNDI stuff that's different, or it may be one is Mongo and the other is SQLite for developers. So,
well, something like H2 for development, maybe Oracle in production, whatever,
Yeah, whatever. That's probably a better example, maybe HBase versus Mongo or something like that. That's a little easier. So you can group beans and enable them selectively, and you can enable multiple beans at once. So here's kind of an example of the dev and the production. So you have a local config versus a production config.
So this is on the Java config class now, not just the service type.
Yep. And so what you're doing here is for the entire Java config saying, use this to load all my beans, or you can do it on a bean by bean basis so that for this particular bean, the profile only aligns to this bean.
Hi, question?
Yeah, can things be assigned to multiple profiles if it doesn't violate any rules?
Yep. You can actually, great question, thank you. So you might, for example, have a dev profile active, and then you have a specific set of beans that are only active in this one use case or whatever. So you can actually activate multiple sets of profiles. And subject to the same rules as you'd expect. You can't have the same bean with the same ID and the same class defined twice in Spring, and you certainly can't do it if you activate two different profiles that have the same bean, the same definition. So make sure you'll get errors, but yeah. Question?
And I tag a particular bean saying, well, this is for QA and production?
Yes, just say add profile, and then there's an annotation in the question is, can I tag one bean for two different environments? Yes.
So this is, you saw this in the example, but basically this is the code that, in case you didn't catch that, for setting the active profile, and then you refresh the context. Yeah, question in the back? Just stretching? I thought you were stretching in the green, but I wasn't trying to ignore you. So here's the example. I won't do a demo, but showing loading multiple profiles at once.
That's a well-known environment. It's a -d argument. If you specify that, that'll also load the profile. You don't have to do it programmatically.
So here's doing that in the web XML. In the web XML, for your dispatcher servlet, you can pass in a init param specifying what your active profiles are. Oops, missed them.
What's the order of overriding if you specify a -d and then you specify it as an init param in web XML?
System properties will be loaded, and then the stuff you load on the actual. Yeah. It's the ordering you specify when you use the add first versus add last. So if you write a system-d argument or a system property, and then in your code you do add first, that will override the system property.
He's talking about web XML. Web XML versus.
Oh, well, yeah.
I don't know.
So the dispatcher servlet goes first, I assume.
Yeah.
I assume that's the overrides the environment one, but Yeah. Or no, maybe it's the other way around. I suspect it's probably the other way
I
around.
would think
The one
this
that's
guy
useful.
wins, but
Yeah.
you tell us, man. No idea. I would recommend not doing that.
Yeah, sorry.
So where are we at here? So here's a fun kind of example where you could randomly switch your
This is a servlet
environment
3.
just for fun, but some code that you can do there. And then we'll jump in over here, and this is where you're defining your own context initializer, where you're
That's a
doing
hook.
that, and you can pass that into the dispatcher servlet is one option. It's kind of a hook instead of doing what we did before with the init parameters. You have your own class. And then in servlet 3, they made it quite a bit easier, so you can specify it there in the crate.
So in servlet 3, you don't need web.xml. You can just specify what's called an application initializer, a web, servlet initializer.
Do it
And
all in
here,
Java.
What? Yeah,
Do it all in
Java.
Java.
Java's pretty good at expressing Java. Who knew? So here we just have a regular template class that Spring provides. It asks you certain questions. You have a chance to override the profile, and you can do programmatic. You can programmatically determine which profile should be loaded now. You have a hook to specify that before the dispatcher servlet is, brought into life.
All right. It can be used with Spring Boot, so that's the same idea with the property that you specify there. And we'll show some of that. And there are some special properties. So the default property,
Profile.
gosh, I did it again. The default profile, Josh makes me nervous, is there by default if you don't have any other profiles loaded. And then Cloud Foundry activates a cloud profile so that you can kind of very easily, without doing a bunch of extra work, you can know that you're in Cloud Foundry, and have things behave differently when you're in that cloud.
Default is activated in absence of any other profile.
And it's not there if you've defined your own. So I'll do a quick demo with EC2. And this kind of shows an example. This is how I did things at JustMe, where I wanted to be able to switch profiles through EC2 tags, so without rebuilding and let it be driven from EC2. So I'll start here in EC2. This is our, whoa, what did happen? Oh.
Danger, danger.
No. I even logged in ahead of time to make sure it was good, and I don't know. Oh, no. Come on, network. Talk to me. All right. So here's my tags. I defined something called profile. You can call it whatever you want. I just need to have that profile, and we're going to look at the cat. And so actually, let me jump into the code.
So he's got a web application.
Yep.
He's going to deploy it to EC2 and demonstrate how to use the console to declaratively specify a profile and then have that trigger change in the application.
Yeah. So maybe I set the active profile from a system property, right? So I've defined a system property, which I'll show you here. So here, let's make it kind of here in the middle. Oh, shoot. Let's not do that. Let's do that. OK. So the first thing I do is, sorry, it's a little hard to read. I don't know if the highlighting helps, or it probably doesn't help. I define a profile using this EC2 describe tags. And I do some code. I've got this on a slide. It's a little easier to see. But basically, I run bash scripts and some shell scripts to pull that out. And then I pass it in with a -d, that profile. So it's going to run, what was it, cat that I had before?
Because the internet is built on cat pictures. Never forget.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right.
So we're using Spring Boot, by the way, to keep this dead simple. That was the entire application, that one code page. Yeah. This is the entire web application, except for the Maven Palm.
Is it up? Is it up? Oh, I forgot to. I'll skip showing you the default profile, maybe. All right. Here we are. Oh, no. Oh, no. Is it not up yet?
Give it a second.
Yep.
Questions while we're waiting and twisting in the wind here? Yeah. One in the back first, sorry, and then go on. No, not that I know of. That's a good idea, though. Wouldn't be hard to do, right? Because you can just do, you can create your own property source. So as long as you're willing to respond to a key called foo.asterisk or whatever, or foo_asterisk, and you can resolve that however you want, you know? But by default, it doesn't do that. It's a hard match on the string. But yeah.
So we got the web page up, and save the tag. So now I've updated it. So we get the web page up. Talks about cat. I'll skip showing you the code because we kind of did that in the earlier example. Restart things. So I didn't change any code. The only thing that I changed is this EC2 tag, and I'm able to pull that in. And while that's loading, I'll go ahead and.
What's your question in the meantime?
I just wanted to make sure with understanding what the main focus of this session is. So property sources is the big thing we use to configure these, and profile source is the thing that we use to swap beans limitations itself.
Well, this is at configuration time, but yeah, that's a good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With both of those things, and then we have all the flexibility we need.
So
yeah.
the
and then we'll jump into conditionals and things like that.
Yeah, we're not done yet. Believe me.
It's coming. It's coming.
Yes.
Yes. We'll reload beans. I think
Yeah.
Josh will do that. But we should move on. Anyway, this is how you do it in EC2. Describe tags. Here I hard coded an instance, but that's not really what you want to do. Really, you want to have another one that tell me what my current instance is, so that I can kind of stitch it all together. And then here I showed Jetty, even though we're doing Spring Boot with Tomcat, but this is how you would do it in Jetty, which is just like what I showed over there. So I will jump over here, and we should see something about bacon, maybe, if our network is happy. Yeah, and there's our bacon. So very good. Everybody clap. Wonderful. I don't know if that
bacon!
works this way.
How can you not clap for bacon?
Very good. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Josh.
Okay. So Spring 4 is upon us, to be released at the end of this year, hopefully. All going well. we introduced an annotation called @conditional. @conditional lets you conditionally create and activate a bean. So if you think about what profiles do, they say, given this profile, load this bean. If the profile is not active, quote unquote, then I don't want this bean to be here. So it's in effect the same as if you didn't bother defining the bean at all. Okay, it just lays dormant as a config, as part of the code, but it's never actually executed. We've retroactively made profile a specialization of the conditional mechanism. Okay, so conditional now says, enter this test. If the test comes back true, then load the bean. If it doesn't, then don't. And that's now, profiles are just a specialization saying, answer the test about whether this profile is active. Conditional delegates to a condition object. Okay, condition objects are where you hide you can write the test, whatever that true-false condition that you want to express is, you write that there. We've been talking about Spring Boot at the show. I encourage you all to play around with it when you get a moment after the coffee. But the one thing I want to mention is that there's a lot of really cool @conditional annotations, annotations that implement the @conditional annotation as a meta annotation, right? So they all have the same properties as that annotation, but they have specific condition objects already set for you. So you can say, for example, on class condition. So you say @bean in your Java configuration and put on class condition, and this bean will only be loaded, for example, if the class you specify in the on class condition is available, right? This is very useful. You can build an application that loads up and say, oh, well, are there any other data sources defined in my context? If there are, then don't bother loading the H2 embedded in-memory database for testing. Just let the one that's already there work. Or test the environment. You can test whatever you want, right? You can write that code inside the condition and then use that in your beans. So let's take a look at that. We'll show an example here. Now then, so we are in the core package here. And then we have @conditional. And the idea here is I've got a configuration class. Close that, and this, and this. And I've got a configuration class. It loads properties from a property file. That's fine. And what I want to do is I want to define a database based on which properties are in my configuration file. So I want Postgres if somebody specified Postgres. That's my production database, or it's more like the production environment. So as long as somebody's given me valid Postgres properties in the config file, I'll go ahead and create that bean. Otherwise, assuming somebody has enabled the H2 embedded database property, just a little flag saying true, then load that one. So I get a data source out of the deal no matter what. I get one data source, or two, depending on whether you have all the properties available. I'm using @bean, so this is Java configuration. And embedded database, by the way, is just actually a subtype of data source. So what you have here are two different definitions for the same type of object, okay? And what I've done is I've written my own @conditional annotation. As I said, it's a meta annotation, so you can take Spring 4's @conditional, specify your own custom condition class, and then add that to your conditional annotation, and then that is a sort of a DSL4 saying, load this bean only if these properties are in the environment. If they're not, then I don't want that bean to be available. Let's take a look at the actual implementation on this. So, as I mentioned, Spring Boot provides lots of great conditions, and there's a lot of good machinery in there for building condition classes, so I've gone ahead and just extended one of those. And the idea here is...
Great.
Thanks. The idea here is that when this annotation is loaded, it calls this class, and it invokes another method, which in turn invokes getMatchOutcome. Here I can use the metadata that's provided for me as part of the callback method to inspect the value on the annotation. So my annotation over here has a value property, right? And I want to be able to read that at configuration time. So I'm just using a little bit of a reflection witchcraft to pull that value out and inspect it. It's an array of strings. And I'm specifying property values, property keys that have to be present in the environment for this bean to be created. I then access the environment because I have a context reference here, which gives me a pointer to the environment. And I just simply, I load them, put them in an array, and I assert that they're all there and they're not null. If they're there, then this is true, in which case I say, yep, go ahead and match. If they're not there, I say no match, and I say you need to provide these keys. Or some of these keys are not there, okay? Questions on that? We'll go ahead and run a demo. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Okay. So here's the, here we go. Got an application context, which is now entirely too long a line. There you are. So I'm saying, load the application context. It's going to load my Java configuration class. My Java configuration class has 2 data source beans. Both of them are using this conditional on properties present annotation that I've just described to you. And then I query the context for all the beans of type data source. And depending on which kind of config properties I've got in the context, I might have 0, 1, or 2 different beans, right? I can toggle that dynamically. So let's do that. Here I've got a, so you remember the first class that I expect to have, the first type of property, are all my Postgres properties, right? So you can use Java public static final constants in annotations, or just public, final constants. So here I'm saying if there's a Postgres.user property, and if there's a Postgres.password and a Postgres.url and a Postgres.driver class, then go ahead and load this Postgres definition, because I can go ahead and inject the environment and access those properties. I know that that will work. I don't want to get this bean created. It'll try and access the properties and then null pointer, and then everything goes to heck, So this is very convenient. Otherwise, I'm looking for an h2 property, just called h2.dbname. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to just use, application core, okay. Config, voila. So here are my properties. I've got this thing called h2.dbname, and I've got a database connection down here. If we run this code here the first time, voila. Come on. Okay, so it found, I hope you can all see, 2 data sources right there, right? So that means that both of them are there, and they're both usable. And of course, if I did something like this in my code, I can do @inject data source, in my component classes, I mean, right? So I can actually do that somewhere.
You're in your main.
Yeah, just as an example. I would get 2 beans, and I would resolve them by type, and I would get an array of beans. If I did @inject data source, just one reference, I would get a failure, right? Because I don't have a unique qualifying bean. I have 2 beans that are dubious, ambiguous. Now I can go back to my code here, hide that property, and then rerun this thing. And you get just one data source. I've got the Postgres one, but not the embedded one, okay? And I can do the same. Yes, sir?
So the no match message, can we see that written out?
Oh, yeah. I think we, oops. Maybe you should. I think we changed the logging somewhere, because I've just got system out.
I'm sure it's in there.
Come on. You must be this smart to use a laptop. Yeah, it's not there. But if you were to put a breakpoint on there, you could see it being tested. So questions on that? So far, so good? Spring 4 mechanism, very, very powerful. This alone makes, I love profiles, but this is what we've always wanted, right? We wanted the ability to do this dynamically. Okay, moving on.
Would it be much better to use the Groovy Bean Builder?
Fair point. Groovy has a great, you can use the Groovy Bean Builder. You can actually do this with Bean Factory post-processors. Remember the thing I mentioned before? That's a hook, whereupon you can actually register beans dynamically. You can actually say, I want to add this bean as though I configured it in XML programmatically, okay? Okay, so the next question is, now we're looking more towards runtime, okay? What's a good way to trigger a change in the state of a bean at runtime? How many of you used OSGI? Oh, okay. This is where I wait for tomatoes and duck, OSGI had a lot of promise. One thing that people still want, they don't want OSGI, but they do want some of the properties attributed to OSGI. One of the things they want is the ability to reload a class. I would argue you probably shouldn't be reloading entire class definitions at runtime. That's probably not very kosher, especially now. There's no reason you couldn't just do a rolling restart and achieve the same effect of keeping one thing running while reloading it somewhere else and then rolling back. But there are ways to change the state of objects at runtime. Again, I've never worked anywhere where I could actually just go into production and change the class in the XML or anything like that. That's a good way to get fired. So having that as a feature is not necessarily something you want, but it can be a great tool to have available in your toolkit if, for example, something goes wrong in one environment, you need to route somewhere else or do something live from a console, right? So there's one way to do this. This is a this is a hammer for what I think is more of a, like a mallet when you really just need a knife or something, very small. You can actually programmatically destroy and reparent application contexts. If you guys have used a Spring MVC or Spring inside the web machinery, you know that there's a context loader listener filter, or listener rather, that you deploy and configure in your servlet machinery, and then that creates an application context, and those beans are global to your application. They're available to all the dispatcher servlets that you have configured in the application itself. This is a good place to put things like filters that are common to everything. It's a good place to put service references that you share across different parts of your web application. You might have one dispatcher servlet for Spring MVC web application, another dispatcher servlet for Spring Webflow, yet another one for a REST service, etc. Right? So that's a very common thing. So you have a parent-child relationship. The beans in the application context at the context loader listener level are global, and then the dispatcher servlet children have an application context that can see the beans globally, but the children, the global one cannot see the beans in the children, right? So if you have things you want to change, this structure, this hierarchy, this is actually something you can take advantage of in just regular application contexts. Application contexts themselves have parents. They're hierarchical. So if you have if you have an application context and then you add a child, the beans in the child can be destroyed independent of the references in the parent. Okay? So this is a good way if you want to change a whole swatch of beans, right? If you want to programmatically destroy all the beans in a child and then reparent it, you can do that, and that in effect achieves that achieves what you're looking for. It reloads the whole context, which is, again, I think it's a very heavy-handed way to solve the problem, but it does work. So let's take a look at that one. How are we doing on time? Oh boy. 12:45. We got, what, 20 minutes?
Yeah, we're good.
Whew, okay, good.
We're good.
Okay, gird your loins, folks. This is going to be quick.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I always kind of wanted to do. Many years ago, I talked to Josh about how to do this, where I had an app that's deployed into a stage environment, right? It's, I have some dependency on a service that's not working, that's down. A good example would be the authentication service. If the authentication service goes down, no one in my team can log in, nobody can work. And so what I wanted to do was reload, I want to use the live service on my stage server all the time and know that things are working. But if that dependency gets broken and it stops working because LDAP problems or whatever it is, then I want to, I have control to kind of go into a little web page I wrote and redeploy that bean and change, what gets loaded. And that's where, I've used this before.
And we're showing here examples of where you actually go in there and do it manually because this is a demo. But the flexibility here is something you could actually control programmatically, so you can actually build very resilient systems.
Like an admin page. Because, the idea is a lot of times you don't have access to shut down your server, restart your server, put a new war up, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is one approach. I've got two contexts. I've got a parent context, which has a configuration class, which simply defines a bean of type A, okay, for simplicity's sake. And then in my example, which I've now misplaced, I have another context, a child context, which I'm setting the parent to be the first one, right? So here's where I'm saying set parent equals the first one. Then I'm registering the B configuration class, which contains a definition for the B bean, okay? B bean is just it's an empty bean, nothing special except for maybe a little string or something. So if in this case, I register the child context, and then I can ask the child context for the B bean, and if I ask the child context for the A bean, which we also accessed up here when we created the parent, I get the same reference, right? So the parent context bean version of A and the child context version of the A bean are the same in-memory instance. I don't get them; they're not recreated. I can then destroy the child context and assert that the A bean still lives and it's still there. And if I wanted to actually go ahead and create a new parent, I could do that as well. Okay, don't do this. You can. We do this actually. We do this in some places. If you use Spring Batch Admin, for example, which lets you deploy batch jobs live from a console, this is basically what's happening. We're creating a new context and launching it, and that creates a little bit of isolation, if you will. So the machinery for Spring Batch lives globally, but each job inherits that machinery each time you run it. Okay? Questions on that?
Was your question about refreshing beans, or was it about inheritance stuff? Or were you satisfied with my answer? Good enough? Okay. Because I just realized like I didn't really talk about inheritance, but
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like,
yeah. If you can do that, right? But it's, what can you do and what can the operations people do, and the wrong chain of people.
So, and another reason to avoid rolling restarts in some cases is maybe you just want to change one thing. That's pretty common. You don't need to restart the entire database. All these services, sometimes you have things that take a long time to boot up. Hibernate takes forever. You have no idea how many times people have said, "Oh, Spring takes forever to boot up. Get rid of Hibernate." Yeah. It's instantaneous because this is just memory, guys. There's no delay in using Spring.
I know at JustMe we had problems with sometimes on startup we would get in a deadlock due to cache problems, whatever it was. But it was pretty common for us when we deploy that it would deadlock and it wouldn't start. So,
okay. So I just wanted to briefly introduce this idea of an application event. How many of you guys have used the application events in the core container? Been around since day one again. The idea is that we have kind of a message bus in the context. Beans can publish messages that are delivered to all the other beans that are interested in receiving those messages. Okay? These are called application events. There's a class, you can extend it. We use it all the time for machinery, for the core container, for example. So if you call application context.refresh, that triggers a refresh event. I'm sorry, it triggers a context refresh something or other event. And you can actually implement an interface to receive that interface. You can say application context event aware or something like that. Or no, application listener, that's what it is. So you say implement application listener and then specify a generic type, and that generic type is used to filter the type of message you get. So here's a way for one component to trigger or to change the state or to send information to all the other beans without the other beans knowing about the original component. Okay? This is a very good way for you to decouple your components while still communicating. Having introduced that, let's take a look at a more fine-grained approach, I guess. This is a slightly, this is kind of sneaky, but it's an answer to a common question, which is how do I reload just that one bean? What if my database goes down and I need to point it to another one? Everything's fine except for the database. I just want to reload that one little database. So with what we've learned so far, you guys know that there's a lot of proxies in the world, right? Java is a very statically typed language, but there's a great mechanism called a JDK proxy. We use that to great effect all over the container. We also have cglib proxies, which you also see when we do aspect J.
Too slow.
Too slow?
Yeah.
What is?
The startup time. It kills me.
For what? Aspect J?
For cglib. I try to avoid. I like the proxies. I like the JDK proxies.
cglib's faster. And actually, you can't avoid it. So if you're using Spring in the last 6 years, you've been using cglib. Yeah. But yeah. No, so these proxies are good. They're very, very powerful. Different requirements for each, right? So JDK proxies are limited to interfaces, whereas cglib can actually proxy a concrete class. It basically creates a dynamic subclass at runtime. So it says, hey, I've got a class A. I want all method invocations on that bean A to have an auditing call around it. With cglib, it basically creates a subclass, A subclass, inserts the auditing code for you dynamically. It generates the bytecode, if you will. So we know about proxies. We know about application events, which we can use to communicate from one bean to another. And we know about factory methods, right? We know that having a recipe for defining the construction of a bean is very convenient. If it's a Java configuration factory method, that's great. If you use JSR 330 javax.inject.provider, you can actually you can pass around this factory method, this reference, for creating a new bean. And then that brings us all to this. Let's see, good. Shh. Let's see. So, how rude. Let's see. Refresh. Here we are. So here's the example code. I'm not expecting you to grok all of this right now. It's really easy code, I promise, but it's just sort of bigger than a slide. So the idea is I've created a factory bean called a refreshable factory bean. This is a class you guys can reuse if you like. All it needs is a provider reference. So you give it a provider, a javax.inject.provider reference, which you can get from Spring, by the way. So if you're using Spring, and let's go here, but I can actually do, if I have an app bean method like this, I create an app bean data source, whatever, right? And that's my Java configuration bean method. In my component code, I can then say, instead of saying inject data source, I can actually say @inject javax.inject.provider of data source provider, and that gives me the ability to control when I get that definition. It gives me late binding. I can actually invoke data source provider .get, and I'll be given back the data source that I have specified up there in the Java config, right? So that's very convenient. It lets me control when and where I create that bean. So of course you want the bean when the application starts up. That's the normal semantics that we're all used to. But it's very nice if you want to change the bean to be able to re-invoke that creation again, right? So having a provider is a very useful thing. Okay. Questions on that before I move on? Okay, good. So I have a refreshable factory bean. The idea is I give it a provider, and it will do some black magic and sorcery to create a proxy for you. And then the proxy is going to receive and respond to events in the context, okay? So I'm dynamically implementing this application listener, right? So if I give it a provider of type T, where T is a data source, this factory bean will create a data source for you. It'll return a proxy of that original data source bean. It implements the contract of the type that you've given it. Except that this class that I'm dynamically proxying for you at runtime, implements application listener, and it can receive events, and it has a method on it called refresh. And I've provided this method in an interface called refreshable down here. Okay, so public static interface refreshable of T refresh, and so whenever somebody gets my proxy, if they inject my proxy into their code and then cast that proxy to the refreshable interface, it'll work. It won't fail because the bean now dynamically implements that interface, and then from there I can invoke. How much time do we have? People are queuing outside.
I don't know if the next one starts. I don't know. I don't know if there's a gap.
You can. Sorry. Oh, good. That's just enough. So I can cast that proxy to refreshable, even though the original bean didn't implement refreshable. The proxy that you get when you inject it into your code does. So I could actually just call refresh, and what that will do is it will go to this provider that we've given it. Right? We've provided this provider at configuration time, and it'll re-invoke it for me. It'll in a sense resource the bean. However you created that bean the first time, you create it again. Okay. So that's a little bit, the code is kind of gnarly, but basically what we're doing here is kind of just basic trickery to create a bean that complies with the application listener semantics, right? It publishes a bean. It can be refreshed directly, or you can publish a message of type refresh event and specify which bean you want to refresh. And if this bean is the bean that you want to refresh, it'll refresh itself dynamically. So I don't even have to inject or know about the bean that I want to refresh. I can just publish that event, and anything that implements that interface will also refresh, okay? Questions on that before we show it off? Going once, going twice? Good, let's see. So now in my example here, go down here, refresh, I've got a swappable data source configuration class. Same as before, I've got @enable transaction management, I've got @configuration, I've got property sources. The property source is configuring property values that I need, like my driver name and all that stuff. And then in my data source down here, I'm not returning the data source directly, I'm returning a refreshable factory bean, which I then pass in a provider for, and the provider, all it does is it has the recipe for creating my data source as I need it. Okay, so when JDK8 comes around, this will become just a lambda, and then it becomes very simple. You won't even need that. But the idea is you've got, instead of a data source directly, you've got a refreshable factory bean of type data source, and then you create the recipe for your particular use case. So here I'm saying, create the bean by looking at the environment and getting the database username, database password, etc. and then put the whole thing together and give me a driver data source that I can use. If you were to refresh this bean later on and those properties have changed, then they will be refreshed as well, right? You'll get the new property values. So this is very convenient. You can actually change property values and get the implementation back. And now, let's see. Everything else is basically the same. It just shows how to load data. And then here is my main class. And here I've got a application context, as before. You don't need that right now. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and load the data source bean. I'm going to work with the customer service, actually, do work with it, I guess, whatever I want. I can use the data source with the connection parameters, right? So here's a method I've created to simply, I'm going to set the connection properties, this database username, the database password, on the context by adding a property source to the configuration, right? So here I'm saying get property sources, add a new property source. The first time this happens, when the application context starts up, there are no properties, so this is just the first time those properties are introduced, works just like normal. And then I go ahead and do a publish event, and everything gets created the first time. So here, whoops, close that one. Close this guy. Whew. Sorry guys, if I'm confused, I can only imagine how you guys are doing. Way too many files open. Okay. So I can go ahead and update the property, update the environment with those new properties for my database. It's not Scott Tiger. This one's far easier to remember and hack. It's SA and then blank. And I'm using an embedded database here, connecting to my CRM_A database, which has, I think it's like records in the odd numbers, and then the other database, CRMB, has records in the even numbers, okay? Just as a point of distinction. I can work with a service here, in which we'll see that, I'm just going to go ahead and load all the customers using that service. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to obtain a reference to the service, and then call load all customers. It's going to use the JDBC template, connect to that data source that we've provided, load all the records, and then print them out. Of course, if we change the data source, then we'll see different data, right, if there's a different database. So, or it could just fail. That's also an option. No. Fair enough. Main. What did I do? I did, didn't I? I feel a fool. Thank you.
There you are.
Boy, oh boy. Never, ever, never, ever make changes to a demo live. Okay. Try this again, this time with more gusto, okay? Okay, voila. So the idea is I've loaded my database the first time, and I get records 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, etc.
Evens.
Yep, and then those odds. And then I refresh, and now I've changed, what I've done is I've triggered the refresh that called the update data source. I changed the properties that are in the environment the second time, gave it a new connection, right, new connection information, and when it refreshed, it loaded those properties and recreated the data source. So now I'm connected to a different database, and then when I call the load all customers again, I get the odd numbers, okay? So any questions on that so far? Yeah, hi.
So if you have multiple listeners for the same application event,
Yeah.
can you control the order that they're notified?
Huh. I haven't, this is just a demo. I hadn't even thought about that. Maybe we could do that. I mean,
If I recall, they're all notified on the same thread, correct?
right. The application events are published on the same thread, yes. This is not a messaging solution. This is more about, okay, I'm in a pinch. I need to update this database and maybe that service reference. I don't expect you to, hopefully you don't need to refresh beans in production, but this is a very commonly asked question. It's much better than reloading a whole application context. Yes, sir?
So I would be able to set up a scheduled job watching for changes in that project file and just...
Sure. I just built this. It's just a very simple, it just listens for that refresh event. Whenever you want to publish it, that's up to you. And as long as there's a refresh event, it'll refresh all beans that implement this refreshable interface, which is to say all beans that are using that refreshable factory bean that I've just created for you guys. It's okay?
Is your bottleneck because you have to synchronize, I guess, at that point. You can only allow one thread at a time to get the actual implementation of the data store or data source provider.
So what I do is I'm assuming a singleton in this case, right? I don't want multiple beans. I keep an atomic reference to the currently created bean. So what happens is you call a method on the data source interface. The proxy receives the method, and it forwards the message. It forwards the method invocation to the actual data source that we created in the beginning. If you call refresh, then subsequent invocations are also forwarded to that original, to that new updated atomic data source. So there's no bottleneck. It's just I need a place to store the bean once it's created, right? I don't want to recreate it each time. So you call refresh, creates the bean, stores it in the atomic reference. All calls get forwarded to that bean just like normal. And then subsequent invocations, same thing. It's okay? Okay, so just for, for the appearance of actually having a more real-world use case in mind, I've also set this up using JMX. So I've actually created a configuration class. I've created a second bean, right? It's just a little endpoint. It's an admin bean I created just so that if I needed to, in a pinch, I could log in with JMX, change some properties. That would publish the event, and that would refresh the bean and make it available again, okay? So here's my JMX. This is the Spring JMX managed resource annotation, org.spring framework, JMX export annotation, blah, blah, blah. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to create this bean here called update data source, and it's got a JMX exposed operation, which I can look at. And it expects a username, a password, and a URL. I take that information, I put it in the property source here, just as I did before, contribute the property source to the environment, and then I publish a new refresh event. Okay? So this is something I've exposed through JMX. You might have a web application, you might have a Swing UI, who cares? But the point is you need some place where an operator can go in and dynamically change these things. And then my configuration class is the same as before, except I've also now registered automatic mbean export, right? And I've also registered this database console admin bean that we have so we can change things via JMX. Once I have that, I run the same code again. Okay. Now, I've got, where's JConsole? Hi, JConsole. JConsole is this great little utility for working with JMX resources. It is by no means the best way of working with JMX, nor is JMX the best way of dynamically monitoring beans or managing beans. But it's what we got, so we'll use it. Or it'll fail. Oh, for Pete's sake. I left it running overnight. Mea culpa. I mean, I left JConsole, not the code.
It didn't sleep that long, Josh.
I know. Okay. Go away.
I think you only ran the grep. Oh, is it still running?
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't paying attention.
Good. Goodbye. So now, my code, my Spring application is still running, right? It's a background thread. I've launched JConsole. It sees that I've actually created this save the environment refresh JMX main class, and I've got beans I want to look at. I'm just using insecure connections, no problem. Once I get there, I can see all the mbeans that have been exported, including this JMX data source thing that I just talked to you guys about. There is my update data source operation, right? So here I can say, update the data source, change it to be SA, still blank over here. And then go over here and change the database URI to config. I'm going to point it to CRMB instead, okay? And then I just hit. Now, mind that console down there, okay? I'm going to, yeah, there it is. There you go. I'm going to clear the log so you guys can see what's going on. Now, hit update. Method successfully invoked. No kidding. And the swappable data source configuration class is kicked in, and I've recreated the new database, and there's my configuration values. So it just recalled the provider that we gave it at the beginning. Those reobtained the values. We've changed those values, so now the data source we got is created and it's different, okay? That was fun. Yes, sir?
Did you do that without the Spring thing, though? Just pure JMX?
Yeah, but you can log into things with JMX. Yeah, you can monitor beans with JMX. Whether you can actually trigger the refresh of the bean is up to you, right? That's the point here. How you refresh a bean, there's no generic good way to do that. If you want to reload a database, there's probably some business logic associated with how you constructed that. So it's up to you in this case. It's up to you to provide the recipe for doing that, right? JMX doesn't do that. It doesn't refresh beans. It doesn't know how to reconstruct an object. Spring knows, but you have to tell it to refresh it. That's what this whole mechanism does for you. Sorry? Well, again, you're going to have some trouble, but you know, that's the point. There's no safe way to do reloading of beans for everybody, but in-flight transactions, in this case, will probably be honored because they're going to already have they're going to have a dereferenced, they're going to have dereferenced the original data source, so that will still work. But then as those things stop functioning, the new data source will be in effect for all subsequent transactions, and that'll work, right? The original stuff that's stuck, the original transactions that were in flight when the database went down, of course, it's going to be botched, right? You might get exceptions. So handle as appropriate. Whew. Okay, guys, that was a long one. Took a long way to get here. Any questions, thoughts, feedback, ideas? Okay, I want to thank you guys for coming. Don't hesitate to reach out to both Kevin and myself on Twitter, StarbucksMan and Java Climber. There's our emails. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email or him on this stuff in particular. I don't want you to come in here with more questions, to leave here with more questions when you came in. The slides will be on SlideShare, as always. You can find our blogs there, joshlong.com and javaclimber.com. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Thank you.